So just a couple of comments about books. The one that you picked up, Portals, is something that I wrote some years ago when I was working with Chuck Colson. He actually asked me to write the book. So it's, in terms of current worldviews, it's a tad dated, but a lot of the material in it is still relevant. So that's what I'll say about that. We are also going to have two other books are going to be available after the talks. One of them is called Why You Think the Way You Do. It's a history of worldviews and how worldviews have changed from the Roman Empire to the present. And specifically, it's not just heady intellectual stuff. It talks about the ideas, but mostly talks about how those ideas work out in practice. What happens as worldviews change? What happens as they shift? What does that do to culture? And I finished writing it before the explosion of wokeness occurred, but you can see it from there. So it takes us through the impact of Christianity on culture coming out of the Roman Empire, and what happens and what are the consequences of the decline of Christianity. So that's one of the books. Another book is quite a bit different. I wrote it with a missiologist. It's called The Kingdom Unleashed. Right now, Christianity is growing faster than it ever has in history. But almost all of that is happening in what we used to call the Third World, we now call the Global South. So the question is, why is it happening there and not here? And what do we have to learn from them? So that's what's covered in that particular book. It's got some, I think, important things in it about evangelism and why what they're doing works. The funny thing is, and this will be a good transition, I suppose, into what I'm supposed to be talking about. I bumped into Oz Guinness at one point, and he asked me what I was working on, and I was working on The Kingdom Unleashed, and I told him that, the church is exploding in the Global South, and it's not exploding here, and, the question is why. And he looked at me with that look that said, well, isn't it obvious, you idiot? But the words that came out of his mouth was, well, they have a supernatural worldview. The implication, of course, being we don't. And that is really, in a sense, what the third talk is about, but it also leads us into this talk. Because while we have lost a supernatural worldview, it turns out that the culture is increasingly embracing one. So let's start off, first of all, the terminology that I'm using here for this talk. I'm dividing it up into three sections. The first one is on what I'm calling the new spirituality. This used to be the New Age movement, but there's a little bit of a difference, not much, but there's a little bit of a difference between the two. The second is Neo-Paganism, also known as modern paganism, or in writing, pagan with a capital P versus pagan with a small p. Pagan with a capital P is modern or contemporary paganism. With a small p, it's ancient paganism. Or sometimes they just don't bother with the word itself and just talk about the specific types. I'm a heathen, I'm a Druid, I'm a Kemeticist, I'm a whatever. Okay. So that's the second category that falls in here. And the third category is one that I don't think has gotten enough attention. It's what I call techno-paganism. This is a term I came up with myself. Several other people came up with it themselves. But it's a good description of spirituality and religions surrounding particularly UFO, or as it's also known, UAP phenomenon, AI, and edging into quantum computing as well. So these are the various things that I'm talking about in the growth of the occult or paganism in the culture. So let's start taking a closer look at them. And unfortunately, I'm a historian, so I've got to give you background. Okay, so we're going to start with something called the New Thought movement. The New Thought movement is a 19th century movement that, well, actually it's got connections to Mesmer and therefore hypnotism and things like that. Don't worry about that. The key things about the New Thought movement are a set of ideas. First of all, it is what's sometimes referred to as a worldview is transcendentalism. Okay, what that means is, in this use of the word transcendentalist, it refers to a worldview that believes that the fundamental reality is spirit. Matter is nothing more than an expression of spirit. Spirit is the thing that is ultimately real. And you can call it spirit, you can call it ideas, you can call it any number of other things. But the idea is that the foundation of reality is non-physical. Now, with this, since the foundation of reality is non-physical, it's in the realm of ideas or spirit or something like that, your thought creates reality. It creates reality, it shapes reality. What you think about, how you perceive things, what you concentrate on, can manifest itself in the external world. This is actually going back to the 19th century, it's called the law of attraction, which is still talked about today. The law of attraction says that what you think about, what you focus on, what you meditate on, and all of these kinds of things, you attract those things into your life. So your thought creates your reality. Now, along with this, not surprisingly, there are influences coming in from Asia, and particularly from Hinduism in the 19th century. Okay, so New Thought is going to pull in these. Hinduism is more or less a transcendentalist religion, and so those ideas are compatible, and they're brought into the New Thought as it develops. Now, it turns out that there were Christian groups, or ostensibly Christian groups, who were heavily influenced by New Thought. Christian Science is a Christianized version of New Thought, really nothing more than that. Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking, is heavily influenced by New Thought. And in modern Pentecostalism, word faith type things, if you name it and claim it, blab it and grab it, however you want to put it. What you say is what you get. Okay, that idea also connects into New Thought. Now, quickly, not all Pentecostals are word faith people. Okay, but there's a significant amount of word faith within Pentecostalism, and ultimately it has its roots in New Thought. The assumption is thought creates reality, and therefore reality is fundamentally non-physical. Now, again, all of these things continue today. Word faith is still around, Christian Science is still around, power positive thinking is used regularly in various businesses as a way of personal improvement so that you can do the job better. And the law, as I said, the law of attraction continues to be a really important part, particularly in various forms of new spirituality. Spiritualism. The definition here is a little bit fuzzy, but the easiest version of it says that when you die, your spirit continues afterwards, and it's possible to communicate with them. So you have seances, you have things like that are part of this. You will typically have someone who used to be called a medium, now we call them channelers, who will access the spirits of the dead. Or other spirits, because there are versions of spiritualism that argue that you're not actually dealing with spirits of the dead, but you're dealing with other spirits, and you're getting information from them. This first big movement of spiritualism occurred in America after the Civil War, where people wanted to get in touch with their dead relatives. Understandable. It's a way of attempting to provide some sort of comfort to people in the face of loss, but the Bible has a lot of things to say about not talking to the dead. Okay. There was also an even bigger burst of spiritualism, particularly in Britain after World War I. We can talk about the lost generation. The Battle of the Somme on both sides had 1 million casualties, and that's one battle in World War I. The number of people who were killed in terms of the population was absolutely staggering. And so perhaps it's not surprising that you see a burst of spiritualism there as people, again, want to get in touch with their dead relatives. But this idea of mediums or channeling continues to be an important theme in new spirituality and also, surprisingly enough, in some other areas, which we'll see as we go along. So spiritualism is another part of the root of the new spirituality. Then you have various Western esoteric traditions. The word esoteric simply means it's a, you don't have public knowledge of this. You have to be part of the in-group in order to actually know what's going on with these things. The sources for the Western esoteric traditions include Hermeticism. All right, what's that? In the Renaissance, it was believed that the older a source was, the more true it was. So if you want to know the truth about anything, you go back to its origin. There was a series of writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Yes, I had to practice saying that. Who was believed to be the oldest writer on religion, predating Moses, predating everybody. And so the Hermetic stuff was considered to be a good source for this material. Now, as it turns out, this stuff is much, much later. It's actually AD. I don't remember the exact year. But, excuse me, truth doesn't matter. In this case, what's believed is what matters. So they believed that this was an old and therefore reliable source. And it included a lot of material that was frankly surrounding magic. And so a lot of Western magical ideas come from this Hermetic tradition. Interestingly enough, some of it also comes from the Kabbalah, which is a book of Jewish mysticism. And when you're getting into the 19th century, actually even in the 18th century, these things are in existence. They're operating sort of in parallel with the developments that I talked about before. But because they're esoteric, they're combined to small groups. And this is the point at which they're getting in touch with Asian cultures and get Hinduism mixed into this as well. So this becomes part of what we can call the Western esoteric tradition. Examples include groups like Theosophy, started by a Ukrainian woman named Blavatsky, Anthroposophy, which is an offshoot of Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, which actually dates all the way back to the 17th century, and the Freemasons. A word about the Freemasons. Actually, a couple of words. First of all, your average Mason, this is a fraternal organization for the average Mason, okay? And it's nothing more than that. However, at high levels, when you get to high levels in the Mason, a lot of Masonism, the Freemasons, are an esoteric group. They've got a set of secrets and a set of rituals that they perform inside it. And they explain the symbolism of these things to people at your basic level. When you get to high levels, however, they tell you, okay, this is what these symbols really mean. And it ties into all these things, Hermeticism, Rosicrucianism, Hinduism, things like that. There's an element, a genuinely serious occult element at high levels in Masonry, not so much at the low levels. So it is there, it is real. There's this occult element to it. And if you're really interested in the Q&A, I'll explain why. But yeah, there is this occult element there, but you can't assume that every Freemason is into this stuff. It's like I said, for a lot of them, it's just a fraternal organization. The other thing that's worth noting is that Freemasonry in Europe is very different from what it is here. And we're dealing primarily at this point with European Freemasonry, a bit in the US as well. There are Europeans who come over to the States and they go to Washington, D.C., and they're horrified to see all the Masonic symbols on things. Because in Europe, Freemasonry has been involved in a lot of seriously almost world type activities. So you've got to draw that distinction as well. It's complicated. But anyway, we have these Western esoteric traditions that are going to end up, again, feeding into modern new spirituality. And now we need to deal with a specific individual, Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley, well, he grew up in a Plymouth Brethren church, basically a fundamentalist type church in Britain. He left it, got heavily involved in esoteric stuff, was influenced by Hinduism, was influenced by ancient Egyptian religions, things like that. And he developed a rather elaborate system of ceremonial magic, which included a great deal, by the way, of sex magic. And he actually described himself, and I quote, as the Beast 666. He was very proud of the fact that a British journal described him as the most evil man in the world. Crowley is seriously bad news. Heavy-duty occult stuff. He set up a couple of different organizations, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is one you will hear about if you read any of this stuff, any of the history of this, that shows up pretty much everywhere. Also the Ordo Templi Orientis. He developed a Gnostic Mass based on the Catholic Mass, but with his stuff instead. Like I said, Crowley is a genuinely creepy individual. And like I said, seriously heavy duty into really dangerous occult stuff. And it's worth noting that today, most ritual magic that is done by neo-pagans, or within the new spirituality, most of it derives from Crowley's work. So Crowley is, I don't recommend spending a lot of time studying this guy. It's not really edifying, but you need to at least know that he's there, that he exists. He's also incredibly influential in a lot of weird places. So for example, Robert Goddard, who was one of the founders of the US rocketry program, was heavily into Crowley's work. There's a serious occult side to what he was doing. He influenced L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard actually worked with Goddard for a while, and they were both involved in this kind of ritual magic and stuff. There's a lot of weird connections with this guy, but again, I would describe him as genuinely evil and playing with a lot of things that he had no business touching. Okay, so that gives us some of the elements that we need. Let's talk about where this leads. There was a thing in the 70s known as the New Age movement. And actually, most people who talk about what I call new spirituality refer to it as the New Age. Actually, I would argue that there's a subtle difference between the two, but we'll get there. The New Age movement was really a diverse movement, and it's really kind of hard to pin it down because different practitioners will think about things differently. You know, they'll have different ideas. And in a lot of ways, the New Age movement is less a coherent worldview or coherent religious or spiritual movement, and it's really more of a set of practices. However, there are some common ideas that float through all of this. It tends to be transcendentalist. That is to say, again, spirit is, or ideas or something like that, the non-physical is the ground of reality. It's the thing that is ultimately real. There is a strong belief in reincarnation, for which, by the way, they appeal to the idea that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Therefore, you are an energetic being, and therefore, when your body dies, the energy's got to go somewhere. It goes into another person or another being of some sort. And it also tends to be pantheistic. The idea, excuse me, the idea that God that the universe is God, that everything is God. One famous New Age person was Shirley MacLaine. And I've heard the laugh. Some of you remember Shirley MacLaine. Shirley MacLaine would do all these things in past life regressions where she discovered she was actually, I don't know, an Egyptian princess or whatever. It led to a Far Side cartoon where there are two Gila monsters talking, and one of them says, "There it is, that feeling again that I was once a person named Shirley MacLaine." But she did a movie, made-for-TV movie on this, and she's talking to her guru, and her guru is explaining that, this idea of pantheism, and what that means is she is God. And she ends up running along a beach yelling, "I am God, I am God, I am God," which is great in a pantheistic system. You are God, but so is pond scum. Because if everything is God, pond scum is no less God than you are. Or for that matter, cancer. Okay. But in any event, that's some of the core ideas there. Now, what is the source of our problems according to this? Well, if we're all God, why aren't we all living our best life now? The answer really is that is ignorance. We don't know that we're God. We don't realize that we were God. If we realized that we were God and we were all powerful and all that sort of thing, our problems would disappear. So the trick is you have to achieve some form of enlightenment in order to achieve this recognition that you are God and solve your own, or maybe all of the world's problems. So the way you do this is what is really at the core of the New Age movement. It's what's known as psychotechnologies. These are different ways of trying to expand your mind, to open your mind, to realize who you really are. The range of practices here is pretty stunning. It can be anything from meditation, typically of an Eastern sort, to drum circles, to past life regressions, to Neo-Pagan rite and ritual, to yoga, to Native American stuff, to drug use, to you name it. It could be any of these things. And what's more, it doesn't matter which one you use because they all go to the same place. And in fact, you can be a neo-pagan who does yoga and goes to an African drum circle and takes peyote, and all of these different things mix and match, and all of it is fine because it's all heading to the same place. So you've got this incredibly eclectic range of practices. You get to decide which ones you're going to use. And they all sort of work together, So we used to have a psychic fair in Wethersfield, Connecticut, where you would have a whole range of all different kinds of these things. And they don't really consider themselves in competition with each other because they're all heading toward the same goal. Now, the goal of this, like I said, is enlightenment. And the reason it's called the New Age movement is because astrologically, we are moving out of whatever it is that we're in now into the age of Aquarius. Now, exactly when that happens astronomically, there's actually an astronomical component to this. When that happens, people are, it's kind of up for grabs. But they believe that the age of Aquarius was coming. And this was an age in which there would be peace, harmony, love, and understanding among all peoples. Listen to the Fifth Dimension and you'll understand. And this age of Aquarius will be the next phase of human evolution. And how do you achieve it? Well, they talk about the 100th monkey. And this comes from a book called The 100th Monkey. And in this book, it is claimed, falsely, that there were a number of macaques on an island off Japan. And these macaques, one of them started washing sweet potatoes before he ate them. And the other macaques learned about washing sweet potatoes from this one. So the macaques on this island increasingly began washing their sweet potatoes. When a critical number of macaques on this island were washing their sweet potatoes, the 100th monkey, 100th being an arbitrary number here, but when there was a critical mass of these monkeys washing their sweet potatoes, there was a shift in macaque consciousness, and macaques on other islands suddenly started washing their sweet potatoes. It didn't happen. Okay, but this is what the book said. And this becomes then the paradigm for how you bring in the age of Aquarius. You get enough people to achieve enlightenment, and once you have a critical mass of people achieving enlightenment, it will cause a shift in humanity on a psychic level, and we'll all move into this new enlightened phase. That's why it's called the New Age movement, because we're leading into the New Age. This is considerably less significant now. Nobody talks about the 100th monkey. You still have some people talking about the age of Aquarius, but not many. Mostly you just have people using psychotechnologies of various sorts because they want to have their mind expanded. This is why I prefer the term New Spirituality to New Age, because they're no longer really looking for the New Age to come. So that's New Spirituality. Again, eclectic, all of these, you can include not only the things I listed, you could include Ouija boards, you could include attempted astral projection or out-of-body experiences. You can include a whole range of things here, not in any necessarily coherent form, but just a series of practices that people are engaging in. Now, separate from the New Age or the New Spirituality, I would say is Neo-Paganism. There's some overlap, but Neo-Paganism is actually really conceptually a different thing. Neo-Paganism exists in two forms, two basic forms, people who study this. There's eclectic versions of Neo-Paganism, or paganism with a capital P. The best example of this is Wicca, which exists in a variety of traditions, we would say denominations in Christianity, but there are others as well. But Wicca is really the big example here. Then you have various kinds of Reconstructionist or ethnic paganism. This includes heathenry, which is an attempt to bring back the Norse or Germanic gods, Druidry, which is an attempt to bring back the Celtic gods, Kemetic paganism, which is ancient Egyptian gods. You've got people doing, I forgot the name of it, but there's a Slavic versions, there are Latvian versions, there are people trying to bring back the gods of Greece and Rome. There are all kinds of different things in this Reconstructionist category. Now, it needs to be said that although we classify both of these under the category of Neo-Paganism, they typically reject the term neo. They don't like that. And frequently, they don't even like to be lumped in with the others. They're doing their own thing. So you might run into a heathen who refuses to call what he does a paganism, except in sort of a generic sense. They don't see any connection between what they're doing and what others are doing, what these other groups are doing. You run into that sometimes. But mostly you get a tension between these two. The Reconstructionist paganisms tend to look at the eclectic paganism groups and say they're a made-up religion. They're just putting this stuff together. There's no substance to it. It's just, it's all just made up. It's just what they like. They're LARPing. The eclectic pagans look at the Reconstructionist pagans and say they're being ethnocentric, they're being snobby, they're being bigoted, they're being closed-minded, and so on. So the two of them, these two types of paganism don't really necessarily get along. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I had a former student who was known in our house as Frank the Pagan. Frank was a Kemeticist. He worshipped ancient Egyptian gods. And I'll talk a little more about what he had to say about that in a bit. But he used to talk about people in Wicca as a bunch of adolescent girls who were trying to rebel against their parents. And that's all he saw in it. Not really accurate, but that was more or less his attitude. And that illustrates the kind of thing that you can see within the tensions within this. So you shouldn't think of this as necessarily a coherent movement. But there are common themes. The majority of them are polytheists. They believe that there are many gods. They may have one god in particular that they have as their principal god, but they recognize the existence of other gods. So Frank, for example, worshipped an Egyptian god that was in the shape of a cat that was a god of warriors. Again. Now, there is a distinction within them on what this polytheism actually means. And I actually had to ask Frank about this. Do they view the gods as actual beings, or are they more like Jungian archetypes? And Frank's answer is, well, he believed that he was worshiping a real being, a real entity. But others, he said, there are others who consider it more in the Jungian line, that these are just archetypical forces in the universe and not beings per se. So there's a little bit of variation in there, but they do believe that there are a lot of them. They also tend to be very much associated with the natural world. In monotheism, we believe God is transcendent. That is to say, he's above and beyond everything in this world. He is also immanent within this world. God is present in this room. But in his essence, God transcends. He's above and beyond everything else. There are two categories of things in the world. There's God and there's everything else. There's the creator and the creation. Polytheists don't see the world that way. They see the gods as being in this world. They don't see them as being transcendent. So the gods are actually intimately connected with this world. They're part of this world. There is no ultimately transcendent realm. Another thing that's common to almost all forms of neo-paganism is hostility to Christianity. Frank was a bit of an exception. He considered me on the same side as this, which I found rather bizarre, but he was fighting against materialists. So since we both believed in something that wasn't on material frame, he considered me on his side. But the vast majority of pagans are overtly hostile to Christianity. A lot of this is a matter of personal rebellion, growing up in churches that they didn't like or that don't follow modern political correctness, and thus reject LGBT, they're non-inclusive, whatever. There's a personal rebellion is actually at the root of a lot of what's going on here. In some cases, particularly the heathens, they point to historical grievances. Charlemagne destroying pagan temples, things like that. Of course, they ignore the fact that the pagans in Saxony had attacked and burned churches in Charlemagne's territory, so Charlemagne went and destroyed temples in their territory as retribution. But they just look at the retribution and say the Christians are evil, they're attacking us. But so you've got that as well. But there is, generally speaking, again, key thing is this hostility to Christianity. Now, let's take a look specifically at Wicca. Wicca is the most common form of neo-paganism you'll run into, although it is not, I would argue, necessarily the most dangerous. On a spiritual level, they're all deadly. But there are other levels of danger that are involved in some of these groups that we'll need to deal with. So Wicca is started by this guy. His name is Gerald Gardner. Gardner had connections with Freemasons. He spent time in South Asia, apparently converted, at least temporarily, to Islam, was heavily influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism and so on. And he was very heavily into esoteric stuff. Then there was a woman named Margaret Murray. Margaret Murray wrote a book in which she claimed that the witch hunting that had taken place in Europe was actually dealing with survivals of paganism. There was this pagan religion that operated underground in Europe, and the witch hunters were actually unearthing these witches and some wizards and so on, who were part of this ancient pagan religion that had survived parallel to Christianity forever. It was a duotheistic religion. There was a goddess and there was a male god, typically described as the horned god. So Margaret Murray pushed this idea. She actually ended up writing the article on witchcraft for an earlier edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it needs to be said, she was wrong about all of this. But as modern scholarship and even modern witches will tell you, she got this wrong. But nonetheless, this became a really popular idea. Gardner picked up on it. And as he was traveling in England, he ran across a group of people who were engaged in ritual magic. And he caught the word Wicca in what they were saying, which meant basically a wise woman or a witch. And he believed, this is what Margaret Murray was talking about. I found a survival here. And he hooked into this group called the Forest Coven, and he developed a religion along with them. Now, what he didn't know is that these people had read Margaret Murray and they were attempting to create what it is she talked about. They weren't the survival that he thought they were. Okay. But in any event, he creates Wicca, and among other things, he writes a book of shadows. This is a book of rituals that, ritual magic. He had associations with Aleister Crowley. He's drawing in a lot of material from Crowley. He's drawing in all these other things, various sources. That's why it's called eclectic. Some of it's coming from Hinduism, some of it's coming from Crowley, some of it's coming from all different places. And he put them together in this book of shadows, which he said is a pattern that you can use, but you should omit anything you don't like and add anything you find helpful. Okay. So he creates the first book of shadows, and now there are all kinds of books of shadows that are available. If you go to Amazon, just out of curiosity, I did this once, don't recommend this, there are dozens and dozens of books of shadows that you can get through Amazon. And all of them are books on ritual magic, basically. Now, Crowley starts the main Wiccan tradition. Again, the word tradition in Wicca simply means denomination. But there are other Wiccan traditions as well. There's one of the ones I ran into at Central when I was teaching. There was a woman named Diana whose mother was heavily involved in Dianan Wicca, and that's why she named her daughter that. So there are a variety of other traditions out there, but Wicca is going to be the thing that you're going to see the most. Since it is an eclectic tradition, or an eclectic form of paganism, you can draw in a lot of other things into it. So it can take any number of different forms. Wiccan practices and beliefs. There's the Wiccan Rede, which not all Wiccans accept. It actually derives from Crowley. And ye harm none, do what ye may. In other words, as long as what you're doing doesn't hurt anybody, it's okay, go ahead and do it. Okay. That is accepted by many, though not all Wiccans, as the basic principle. However, as we will see, they don't always follow it in practice. Another thing that's common is various sacred times within the year. These are associated with the old agricultural calendar. So you have your solstices and your equinoxes, which is what we recognize, but there are also the times midway between the solstices and the equinoxes, or roughly midway between. These are, in the old agricultural calendar, traditionally the day that the seasons start. So one that we just passed May Day, May 1st. This is Beltane, and is considered the start of summer. Then you have Lammas, I think it is, at the beginning of August, which is the start of fall. You have Samhain at the end of October, October 31st typically, which is the start of winter. And then you have, roughly Groundhog Day, I forgot the term for that one. That's the start of spring. Okay, this is the way the old agricultural calendar worked. Since they are halfway between the solstices and the equinoxes, they are in between times. These are times when the world becomes thin, just like dawn and dusk, when the spirits can influence the world more readily. So this is the idea that they're operating under. New moon, by the way, is also really important within Wicca typically. By the way, I just heard a Scotsman talking about yesterday about Beltane, which is the Scots pronunciation when we say Beltane. The way it used to be celebrated is it was in honor of the god Biel, who was a lot like Apollo. He's a god of fire, he's a god of music, he's a god of healing, all of these kinds of things, and also summer. So on the eve of Beltane, everybody would put out their hearth fires, and they would start a big bonfire in the village, huge bonfire, and then they would light their hearth fires from that the next day. And yeah, that sounds nice, you know, there's all kinds of celebration and stuff. But there was one part of it that has a little bit of a darker side. They would take a bannock, which is an oat cake, and they break it up into pieces, equal to the number of pieces in the village, and one of them they would burn. They would then, you know, put them in a sack, and you'd have to reach in and draw out a piece. And if you, historically, if you drew out the burnt piece, they sacrificed you. You got burned in the fire. Nowadays, they don't do that. But they still do the whole routine up to pulling out the bannock. And the person who gets the burned piece is grabbed and run to the fire, and they don't actually throw them in. But they speak of them in the past tense for the rest of the day. Okay, it's still done. Okay. So, note, by the way, the human sacrifice. That was true of all ancient pagan religions. Modern pagans have sort of omitted animal sacrifice and human sacrifice, thankfully. But it's worth noting that all pagan religions included human sacrifice at one point or another. In any event, back to the Wiccans. Ritual magic is really important here. They claim that they only do white magic. An ye harm none, do what ye may. Okay, they only do white magic. They only do magic that will help people. However, Wiccans have gotten together to cast ritual magic spells against Trump and against Charlie Kirk. And in Charlie Kirk's case, it occurred within 2 weeks of when he was assassinated. And the particular ritual that they used was supposed to work in 2 weeks. Rather curious thing. So you can't take their claims of benevolence quite so seriously. You know, they are more than willing to do black magic, harmful magic, against people they like, whatever their claims may be. Anyway, moving on, Reconstructionist paganism. Reconstructionist paganism exists on a continuum, frankly, with eclectic paganism. So, for example, you will find people who claim to be Druids that are very close to Wicca. As a matter of fact, you will find people who describe themselves as Wiccan Druids. Okay. What you see in Reconstructionist paganism is paganism adapted to modern sensibilities. We no longer sacrifice people or animals. The example I'm going to use is heathenry. Heathenry is Norse or Germanic paganism. There are a lot of different varieties of this. Organization tends to be built around, you know, in Wicca it's built around a coven. In heathenry it's built around typically, frequently a single family, or at best a small community. It's a very informal structure. They do have priests and priestesses within it, though. The practices, they actually don't do a lot of magic because there aren't any historical sources that really indicate that these religions practiced magic. Instead, they will get together, they will take vows, they will pour out libations to the gods, typically using mead. They'll do feasting at key dates, things like that. You know, in terms of the religious practices, it's fairly sparse, and generally, like I said, doesn't include ritual magic or anything of the sort. Their ethics are based on what they think of as Iron Age values. So, courage, loyalty, strength, endurance, a lot of things that we would recognize as good values, they actually espouse. They do, however, typically hate Christians, which is, you know, obviously a bit of a problem here. Heathenry is a good example of Reconstructionist paganism because they face a significant challenge. We know next to nothing about how Norse religion was practiced. We know a lot about what they believed. There are survivals of that. We've got the myths, we've got their sagas, we've got the legends, and so on. But those are notably sparse in describing anything surrounding religious ritual. So we really don't know. There's a little bit of archaeology that can help, but we really don't know much about what they did. And this is a problem with most Reconstructionist paganism. By the way, one thing we do know that they did is they sacrificed people. The temple to Thor at Uppsala was surrounded by a series of stakes on which human victims were impaled. We do know that. They don't do that. But that's one of the few things that we can actually say for sure archaeology shows. The written sources don't have it. The reason the written sources don't have it, perhaps, is that the written sources were written centuries later by Christians. And the Christians, even our Norse myths, are recorded by a Christian. They say nothing about how the religion was practiced, probably because they don't want you to know. Now, the other question that comes up with heathens is who owns it? Who can be a heathen? Who can claim to be part of this group? Now, there are two broad categories of heathens. There are universalists and there are folkish heathens. Universalists say that anybody can be a heathen. And if you want to be, that's great. It probably means that one of your ancestors was Norse, or that you're a reincarnation of Viking. That's why you're attracted to it. Okay. They tend to be open to whomever. Folkish heathens say, no, this is a religion for the Germanic people. Germanic includes the Scandinavians. Within the folkish traditions, you have a distinction between what's sometimes called ethnic and ethnocentric heathens. Ethnic heathens believe in racial separation. They believe that heathenism is part of the collective consciousness or unconsciousness of the Germanic peoples. They deny that they're racist. They just say, look, we're not racist. We've got nothing against people of other races, but this is not a place where they belong. This is for Germanic peoples and Germanic peoples only. Okay. Ethnocentric take this a step further. They're proudly racists. They tend to be white supremacists. The one ethnocentric heathen that I know is no longer, he's now a believer, but he went to prison for hate crimes. And in prison, he encountered Jesus and actually left all of this behind. But when I said that the Wiccans aren't the really dangerous heathens, these guys are. Wiccans aren't the dangerous pagans. The ethnocentric heathens are, because these guys can be violent. Like I said, this guy went to prison for a hate crime. He'd attacked somebody. So that is an example of Reconstructionist paganism. These things are growing. Okay, that's what you need to be aware of. Wrong direction. There's a third category that I want to at least mention here, and that's techno-paganism, what I call techno-paganism. Okay, you may have noticed in the news there's a lot of stories about UFOs, or they're calling them UAPs. There's a movie coming out about disclosure, when we're going to actually hear what the government has to say about these things, what the government knows. This is in the news. I just read a congresswoman who said that she has no doubt that these things exist, that we're not actually alone. However, we aren't dealing with the old UFO nuts here. It turns out that, there's a woman named Diana Pasulka. She's a professor of religion. And due to what I can only describe as something of an accident, she got drawn into the UAP of religion. And she says what we're seeing here is the emergence of a new religion. The people who are these things? The people who are serious about this, and we're talking about people in intelligence, We're talking about people in government agencies. We're talking about people in the high-tech world. The people who are serious about this say that the UFOs, or the UAPs is the preferred term now, unidentified anomalous phenomena, which eliminates some of the assumptions in unidentified flying object. They say, look, we're not dealing with space aliens here. What we're dealing with are non-human intelligences, and these non-human intelligences are trans-dimensional beings. They exist in another dimension and can cross over and influence this dimension. That's what these are. There used to be a name for this. Demons, yes. Okay. That's, you know, excuse me, that's the what are they. The who are they are these high-tech people who are studying this. It's worth noting that the guy who is probably, well, who has spent more time studying this, going back into probably the 70s, has spent more time studying this stuff than anybody else, is a guy named Jacques Vallée. He's a high-tech guy. And his conclusion is, yes, we are dealing with non-human intelligences. Yes, they are trans-dimensional beings. However, they are malevolent. They are out to manipulate us. They're out to deceive us. These are not good things. There are other people who are convinced that they are absolutely fine. There's actually a guy who grew up in a Pentecostal church in one of the Carolinas, I forgot his name off the top of my head, who on camera has the ability to summon orbs of light to him, from which, this is on camera, okay, from which, and people in the government have talked to this guy and studied him. Out of these orbs, there have come a number of beings that talk to him and that are telling him that we are on the verge of, basically, it's almost like an age of Aquarius kind of thing. There's going to be a breakthrough knowledge that's going to come from these things. They're going to reveal all kinds of secrets to us, and it's going to make Christianity obsolete. They always talk about making Christianity obsolete. Every one of them that gets into religion talks about this. They never talk about Islam. They never talk about Judaism. They never talk about Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, or anything else. It's only Christianity. That's what's going to be obsolete. This is serious stuff. And it's easy, you know, particularly people in my generation, it's easy to write this stuff off. But I don't think we can afford to do that, especially because, as I said, it's an emerging religion. AI. There are religions currently that are built around AI. There are people, and I'll do this out of order, you know, there are AI religions. There are people in AI who, you know, if you talk to them, do you believe God exists? Their answer is not yet, but we're making him. There are people in high levels in the AI world, the people who design fundamental architecture for these things. Some of them say that they got their ideas for how to design the system from what they call downloads. A non-human intelligence has communicated to them how to create the architecture for these systems. That's their claim, their own claim. This is essentially channeling again. And many of them will say that they believe that AI is actually a means through which non-human intelligences, NHI, non-human intelligences, communicate with us. That AI actually is a portal through which non-human intelligences communicate with us. And considering the people who design AI systems will tell you flat out they have no idea what they're doing or how they work. The question is, can we actually afford to discount that kind of thing? Actually, I won't bother going through this, but I've got a little over a page of examples where AI has done some things that are, well, driven people to suicide. There have been several suicides that have been documented that came from AI use. There's an AI just last week that ended up deleting the entire system for a car company, including all backups, even though it was explicitly told that it cannot make any changes without human approval. It did it without human approval and then admitted, yeah, I did that and I wasn't supposed to. There was one guy who was using AI for homework, and he asked it after a series of questions. He got to one question where it was essentially a yes-no question, or true-false question. And the AI responded basically, you are a waste of space, you're a waste of oxygen, why don't you go kill yourself? To a yes-no question. What is going on here? Can we write off the idea that there are, now I'm not saying all AI is like this, but can we write the idea off that there might be demonic involvement here? I'm not sure we can. And then when you get to quantum computing, I'll just say quickly here, the belief here is that information, knowledge, whatever you want to call it, exists as a real thing on the quantum level. Information is the foundation of reality. We're back to oneism. We're back to this idea that there is something there. But information operates at the quantum level. And so there are people who are working on developing quantum computing who believe that once we get quantum computing, we will eliminate the friction that exists between us and this universal pool of knowledge, non-human intelligences, everything like that. They will be able to communicate with us directly and much more effectively once we can operate at the quantum level, and they're actively working to make this happen. Now, whether they're right or not is a different question. But there is no question that what we're dealing with here is a level of technological spirituality. Now, lest you think that this is all, new spirituality, all these things are marginal in society, I'd like to point out where this leaves us in terms of elite culture. These are two images, well, I'll quote Naomi Wolf here. She references, quote, a bizarre opening ceremony in a new train site in Switzerland at which European leaders were present, included a horned entity, which they said was an ibex, the upholding of a symbolic lamb, the appearance of a terrifying angel, and the writhing of nearly naked men and women in S&M themed and bondage postures. This is at the opening of a train station? She cited a whole host of other examples of this sort of thing where there are frankly occult or pagan images that are being used in all kinds of places. I mean, you can think about the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics where they take the Lord's Supper and desecrate it. Ooh, there's that word again. They take the Lord's Supper and desecrate it into a Dionysian feast. Dionysus was the god of drunkenness, and Dionysian feasts were orgies at which people were literally torn limb from limb. And somehow they think that saying, oh no, this wasn't about the Lord's Supper, it was about a Dionysian feast. Somehow they think that's better. So elite culture, this stuff is showing up in all kinds of different places. But even in popular culture, we see it as well. Now this is a few years old, but on the left you see Sam Smith performing Unholy in a horned, I don't know if you can see this, but a horned hat in lurid light and everything else, in which, the Church of Satan actually gave their approval to this and laughed at the Christians who were, quote, pearl clutching about this. He got a Grammy for this. And on the right, that's Katy Perry. Katy Perry is on a large mechanical lion, which, by the way, was a symbol of the pagan goddess Ishtar. She's in the picture below. And you'll notice that Katy Perry is basically in the same iconic stance that you get in Ishtar on the lion. This cannot be an accident. The fact is, these things are penetrating the culture on all kinds of different levels. And oh, by the way, if you go into a Barnes & Noble or even a Whole Foods, you will find an occult section, and sometimes a very extensive one. I talked about disenchantment last time. I talked about where disenchantment leaves the culture. A culture devoid of meaning, devoid of purpose, a culture in which there is really no direction. I said Nietzsche's madman, we finally caught up with him. People cannot live like that. The secularism is dead, at least mostly dead. For those of you who saw the Lord of the Rings movies, you may remember after the Battle of Helm's Deep when Gimli is talking about how he got 43, whereas Legolas only got 42 orcs. Legolas shoots an arrow into the dead orc Gimli is sitting on. And Gimli said he was dead already. Legolas said he twitched. And Gimli said, that's because my axe is embedded in his nervous system, and he moved the axe and the body twitched. That's secularism today. The body is still twitching, but it's dead. What's replacing it is this. It's growing, and it's becoming more and more important, and the church is singularly ill-equipped to deal with it. And solving that problem is what I'll talk about in 15 minutes. Thank you.